There are four perspectives that Balanced Scorecard and strategy maps address. The financial perspective, which covers strategy for growth, profitability and risk from the perspective of the shareholder of the enterprise. The customer's perspective, which looks at strategies for creating value and differentiation from the perspective of the customer. External business processes look at the strategic priorities for various business processes which create customer and shareholder satisfaction. And the learning and growth perspective, which establish priorities to create a climate that support organisational change, innovation and growth. These four perspectives are typically built, read and used from the top down, or particularly read and used from the top down, but are built mainly from the bottom up. And they're documented in strategy maps. We'll look at strategy map for a private sector organisation and then for a public sector or non-profit organisation. The learning and growth perspective says to achieve our vision, how must our organisation learn and improve? This feeds into the internal perspective. To satisfy our customers, which processes must we excel at? That leads into the customer perspective. To achieve our vision, how must we look to our customers, which in turn feeds into the financial perspective. If we succeed, how we look to our shareholders, and this establishes the strategy. Typically this is built from the bottom up and read and used from the top down. For public sector and non-profit organisations, the diagram, which actually is from the 2004 book Strategy Maps, it's figure 1-2, the diagram is very little bit. The strategy and growth perspective is the same as we saw before. The internal perspective says to satisfy our customers and financial donors, which business processes must we excel at? This feeds into the customer perspective, which says to achieve our vision, how must we look to our customers? It also feeds into a fiduciary perspective. If we succeed, how will we look to our taxpayers or donors? And these feed into the mission. Once again, a strategy map for public sector and non-profit organisations is built from the bottom up, but it's read from the top down. Here's an example of a conceptual strategy map. I'm going to build this from the bottom up, and we'll then see how it's read from the top down. At the bottom we have the learning and growth perspective, which looks at human capital, information capital and organisation capital. That feeds up into the internal perspective, and you can see here arrows feeding from the learning and growth perspective into parts of the internal perspective, the operations management processes, customer management processes, innovation processes, and regulatory and social processes. These feed into the customer perspective, looking at the customer value proposition, product and service attributes, relationship and image. And you see internal processes arrowed up into customer value proposition. So we see the lower perspectives feed into the higher perspectives, and then the financial perspective at the top looks at the productivity strategy in terms of improving the cost structure and increasing asset utilization, leading to long-term shareholder value, and the growth strategy looking at expanding revenue opportunities and enhance customer value. So the purpose of a strategy map is to clearly document the relationships between various strategies established by management in a business. The problem that was encountered with strategic plans traditionally is it was very hard to determine the relationships between various strategies. A strategy map documents these relationships visually with higher level strategies and the lower level strategies that those higher level strategies are dependent upon. And this is why strategy maps have become very popular with management as a visual aid. The balanced scorecard is a table. Now, you obviously can't read this detail. It's not intended that you read the detail. The example is the balanced scorecard used by Mobil North America Marketing and Refining Organization. Now, Mobil is used as an example in the strategy-focused organization. This balanced scorecard from the 2001 book was Figure 2-5. Mobil North America Marketing and Refining Organization was one of the least profitable companies in the petroleum industry in the early 90s. Their return on capital employed was 7%, and in fact they would have made more money if they'd moved out of petroleum marketing and refining and invested their money, considering the high interest rates that were available in the early 90s. They introduced balanced scorecard following the 1996 book and were particularly successful in their achievement. After 5 years, they had transformed the organization from achieving a return on capital employed of 7% instead to a return on capital employed of 12%. Chapter 2 of the 2001 book, Strategy Focused Organization, covers Mobil's experience quite comprehensively, and you'll be able to read that balanced scorecard much more readily in that book. Basically, what it shows is the various perspectives. You've got financial, customer, internal, and learning and growth perspective here. You've got the strategic themes, strategic objectives in those strategic themes, and strategic measures to achieve the strategic objectives. So this matrix shows the relationships as you move further to the right along a perspective row. When we look at their strategy map, their learning and growth perspective looked at climate for action, their competencies, and the technologies that they were using. Remember, this was in the 90s. They were looking at process improvement and Y2K. And learning and growth perspective focuses very much on information systems. That feeds into their internal perspective. We'll look at that shortly, into the customer perspective, and then the financial perspective. So let's have a look at the internal perspective in more detail, and we will be able to understand a little bit more of the situation that Mobil found itself in. From the learning and growth perspective, Mobil established a strategy to build a franchise with its dealers. Now remember, in the early 90s, this was around the time that gas stations started to offer convenience stores for purchasing items in addition to gasoline and other products required for the car. So Mobil established a franchise with its dealers to work with its dealers in a cooperative way rather than the previous adversarial relationship that most petroleum companies had with their dealers up until that point. They introduced new gasoline products and services through gas stations that provided extra support and items for customers. To increase the consumer value, to understand consumer segments, and to establish a support for the dealer that would enable the dealer to profit not only from selling mobile gasoline, but also from selling other food and other convenience items from the store. Additionally, they looked at achieving operational excellence in their refinery hardware performance and their refinery inventory management, and to be a good neighbour by improving environmental health and safety. This internal perspective fed up into the customer perspective and then the financial perspective. So we'll look at the customer perspective in more detail now. From the learning and growth perspective and the internal perspectives, these fed into the customer perspective. The strategies that they established were to delight the customer so that the customer was able to purchase gasoline speedily, and they offered a number of innovations at the time. For example, the ability to pay for gasoline at the pump by credit card, to ensure that the pumps were comfortable and protected from the weather, with friendly and helpful employees, and to recognise customer loyalty, and to establish a win-win dealer relationship so that both the gas station dealers and Mobil benefit from greater profitability with more consumer products, and to help develop business skills. Now you'll see with the additional documentation that's available to you in this course, in the instructor notes for course coordinators, the instructor notes provide narrative detail for each of these slides, and I've incorporated a lot of narrative behind these slides from their strategy-focused organisation book. What they found, what Mobil found, was there were 5 major consumer segments. Each segment was roughly about 20%, and that ranged from consumers who were very loyal to Mobil through to consume and only purchase from Mobil from their local gas station, consumers who were interested in premium brands of gasoline and were prepared to pay more for those, and other consumer segments that were more focused on price and convenience of the gas station, perhaps on the way to work or on the way to pick up or drop off the children at school. Mobil found that the consumer segments that were most profitable for them was roughly about 60% of customers who were very loyal to Mobil or were prepared to pay more for premium brands or for customer convenience. And so their strategies focused on those high-value customers. This led to the financial perspective, and you can see that some of the lower perspectives provide arrows feeding up to the higher perspective strategies. So we're starting to see through these arrows the relationships between higher level strategies and the lower level strategies that they depend upon. Let's now have a look at the financial perspective. Building up from the bottom, we now see that the new sources of non-gasoline revenue, such as the convenience store food items, these fed into the revenue growth strategy, and on the right-hand side, strategies that they introduced into their refinery operation to become an industry sense leader and to minimise the use of their existing assets in gasoline refining, was a productivity strategy that, together with the revenue growth strategy, both contributed to increasing the return on cost employed to 12%. So this was the result in their financial perspective. Now, I've shown this progressively built over those last 4 slides, and I'm going to now show you, rather than building it from the bottom up as we've considered now, a strategy map is read from the top down. I'm going to present this to you now from the top down, and normally a strategy map appears on one page. If I tried to do that, it would be very difficult for you to see any of that detail. So I'm going to break it over two visuals, over two slides. I'm going to bring together the customer and financial perspectives first. Here's the financial perspective that we saw, and that's based on the customer perspectives down below. So the financial perspective, reading and using it based on the customer perspectives, we're starting to see the lower level strategies on which the higher level financial perspectives are dependent. Let's now go down further. We'll look at the learning and growth and the perspective and the internal perspective. The customer perspective and financial perspectives are both fed from the internal perspective to build a franchise, increase consumer value, and in refining achieve operational excellence, and to be a good neighbour. And that is fed from the motivated and prepared workforce, so that we've come from the internal perspective being fed from the learning and growth perspective. So to summarise what I've covered in this segment, I introduced some of the principles of balanced scorecard and strategy maps. And we saw that strategy maps provide a very clear visual relationship between the strategies. We could easily see higher level strategies that are dependent upon lower level strategies.